There is a man lying face down in the dirt under a single tree in the middle of a desert that has no other shade for miles. He is not young. His body has carried him across mountains, through famine, into the throne rooms of kings who wanted him dead. 3 days ago, he stood on a mountain and watched fire fall out of a clear sky, and a whole nation fell on its face in front of him. The smoke from that altar had not even finished clearing before he was running again. And now, here he is, alone, under a tree that barely throws a shadow, asking God to let him die. He does not ask for rescue. He does not ask for strength. He says, simply, that he has had enough, that he is no better than the people who came before him and failed, that it would be better if his life ended right here, under this tree, where nobody is watching and nothing is expected of him anymore. Something about this does not add up. The man under this tree just won the greatest spiritual victory in the history of his nation. He prayed, and heaven answered with fire. He should be celebrated. He should be resting in triumph. Instead, he is curled in the dust, begging to stop existing. How does a man who just called down fire from heaven end up here, 3 days later, wanting nothing more than to disappear? That question is the whole reason we are telling this story. And it hands us the very first lesson before we even go back to the beginning. A person can be standing at the exact center of their greatest victory and still be closer to collapse than anyone around them realizes, including themselves. The answer does not begin on a mountain. It begins years earlier, in a kingdom that had quietly traded its faith for convenience, with a man who walked into a palace uninvited and said something no one wanted to hear. His name was Elijah. Let us go back and watch how a man who could call down fire became a man who could not get up. There is no introduction. That is the first strange thing about this man. Every other major figure in the story of Israel gets some kind of wind-up, a birth story, a family line, a childhood that hints at what is coming. Moses gets a basket on a river. David gets a shepherd boy, overlooked by his own father. Even minor characters usually get a sentence or two of background before they start doing anything important. Elijah gets nothing. He simply appears, already finished, already formed, standing in front of a king and saying words that will reshape the next several years of a nation's history. The text drops him into the room, the way a storm drops into a clear afternoon, with no warning and no apology. One line earlier there was nothing. Now there is a man from a town nobody can fully place, wearing the rough clothes of someone who lives outside the comfort of cities. And he is telling the most powerful person in the land that the sky itself is about to obey him instead of the king. To understand why that moment is so explosive, you have to understand what kind of kingdom he is walking into. The king's name is Ahab, and the story does not present him as a man who needed to announce himself as an enemy of faith. His danger was subtler than that, and far more familiar. Ahab inherited a throne, married well by the political logic of his time, and made the kind of compromises that looked smart on paper. His wife, Jezebel, came from a neighboring kingdom where the local god, Baal, was worshipped as the one who controlled rain, who controlled the harvest, who controlled whether a family ate that year or starved. Marrying her brought alliances, brought trade, brought stability. On the surface, it also brought Baal worship straight into the heart of a nation that was supposed to belong to one god alone. This is the part of the story that gets flattened if you rush past it. And it is the second lesson worth carrying forward before Elijah says a single word. Israel under Ahab did not wake up one morning and announce that they were abandoning their faith entirely. Nobody tore down every altar and declared themselves pagan. What happened was quieter and, in its own way, far more dangerous. People kept the name of their God on their lips while building altars to Baal on the side. They wanted the heritage of one faith and the practical insurance of another. If Baal really did control the rain, why not cover your bases? Why not worship both? Just in case. A kingdom that openly rejects God is at least honest about where it stands. A kingdom that tries to keep one foot in each world is something else entirely. It is a kingdom that has stopped noticing. It is choosing anything at all. This is the world Elijah walks into. Not a nation of obvious villains, but a nation that has slowly, comfortably, reasonably talked itself into believing it can serve two masters without ever having to pick one. And into that world, with no introduction, Elijah speaks 4 sentences, and they land like a verdict. He tells Ahab that as the Lord lives, the God of Israel, whom Ahab claims to serve, there will be no dew and no rain for the next several years, except by his word. Then he turns and walks out. And the text does not even tell us how Ahab reacted. There is no description of the king's face. No record of him standing up from his throne. No soldiers sent to chase the stranger down. Elijah simply says it and leaves, as if the conversation is already finished before Ahab has a chance to respond. Think about what that takes. This is not a man pleading for an audience. This is not a prophet building a careful case, citing precedent, softening the blow with diplomatic language. He walks into the most dangerous room in the kingdom and announces, on his own authority and with no instructions visible to the reader, yet that the sky itself is about to go silent. Here is a detail that should stop you. Baal was worshipped specifically as the storm god, the one who commanded the clouds, who sent the rain that made the crops grow and the rivers run. If you wanted to pick one single power to take away from a nation that had quietly built its security on Baal, you could not choose anything more precise than this. Elijah is not simply predicting a drought. He is walking into the throne room of the false god's biggest fan and shutting off the one thing Baal is supposed to control. This is not random. This is surgical. A drought. In that world, he was not an inconvenience. You waited out with stored grain and bottled water. It meant watching your fields crack open under the sun, watching your animals grow thin and die, watching the wells you depended on for years sink lower and lower until they gave up nothing at all. It meant your children going hungry while you stood in a field that should have been green and watched it turn to dust instead. A drought of years, not weeks, was a slow unraveling of everything a family and a nation depended on to survive. Elijah knew exactly what he was setting in motion, and he said it anyway, with no hedge in his voice, because the silence in the sky was never really about punishing Israel for the sake of punishment. It was about exposing what they had actually been trusting in, underneath all the comfortable language about still believing in God. If Baal could not even produce rain when the real fight came, what exactly had Israel been worshipping him for? Here is the part of Elijah's story that often gets missed entirely. Because the drought and the fire and the confrontations of public life are so much easier to remember than what happens in the quiet stretch right after. Elijah does not wait around to watch Ahab's reaction. He does not stay in the city to see whether the king believes him or not. The text tells us that immediately after delivering this verdict, The word of the Lord comes to him with a single instruction. Leave, go east. Hide yourself by a brook called Cherith, and the ravens will feed you there. Notice what that means. Elijah has just done the most public, most dangerous, most confrontational thing imaginable. Walking into a palace and declaring war on the spiritual compromise of an entire nation. And the very next thing God tells him to do is disappear, not fight, not stay and defend what he said. Hide. This is the third lesson buried in a story that has not even fully started yet. And it is one that gets overlooked constantly by anyone trying to turn Elijah into a simple hero of boldness. Being faithful does not always look like staying in the spotlight after you have spoken the hard truth. Sometimes the very next obedience God asks of you is to walk away from the place where you just made your stand and let the consequences unfold somewhere you cannot see them. Elijah does not get to watch Ahab's face crumble. He does not get applause, or vindication, or even confirmation that anyone took him seriously. He gets a riverbank, and birds, and silence. A man who appears with no introduction is about to disappear with no fanfare. And it is in that disappearance, not in the throne room, that his character is actually going to be built. He turns east. He walks away from the palace, away from the king, away from the only audience that ever saw him speak. And somewhere ahead of him, past hills and dry fields that have not yet begun to feel the weight of his words, there is a brook waiting for him. And for a while, it is going to be enough. The sound of water is the first thing Elijah hears every morning at Cherith. And for a long stretch of time, it is the only sound that matters. The brook sits in a narrow ravine east of the Jordan, cut deep enough into the rock that the walls rise on either side of him, like the edges of a hiding place built by someone who understood exactly what he would need. There is no road here, no travelers passing through. No one from the palace is going to stumble onto this ravine while chasing rumors of a prophet who shut off the sky. Elijah has walked out of the most public moment of his life and into a place where, for now, nobody knows where he is at all. And every morning, the ravens come. You have to sit with how strange this provision actually is, because it is easy to read past it as a simple detail and miss what it is actually saying. Ravens, in the world Elijah came from, were not considered clean. They were scavengers, the kind of bird associated with death and decay. The kind of creature a devout Israelite would have been taught to keep his distance from. And yet, morning after morning, these same birds arrive, carrying bread and meat in their beaks, dropping it for him at the water's edge. And Elijah eats food that came to him through a source his own religious instincts might have told him to distrust. That is the fourth thing this story hands us. Quietly, before Elijah has said a single word about it, God is not above using the source you would least expect to keep you alive. There is no glory in this, no audience to impress, just a man learning, meal by meal, that the God who sends fire from the sky is not above using ravens to keep a person fed. The days settle into a rhythm. Morning comes. The ravens arrive. Elijah eats. The brook runs beside him. Steady, reliable. The kind of sound that becomes so constant you stop noticing it is even there. He drinks from it when he is thirsty. He sleeps near it at night. It becomes, without him deciding this on purpose, the one fixed point in a life that just got turned upside down. The palace is gone. The crowd that should have reacted to his words is gone. What remains is water moving over stone and birds arriving on schedule. And for a man who just shouted a verdict into the most dangerous room in the kingdom, that quiet rhythm might be the closest thing to safety he has felt in a long time. And then, slowly, the brook begins to change. It does not happen all at once. There is no single morning where Elijah wakes up and finds it gone. It happens the way these things usually happen, in small reductions that are almost impossible to notice from inside them. The water that used to rush is moving a little slower. The stones that used to sit fully submerged are beginning to show their tops. The sound itself, that steady background hum he stopped paying attention to weeks ago, starts to thin out, until one day he realizes he can actually hear individual drops instead of a constant flow. This is the drought working exactly as Elijah said it would. The same word that silenced the sky over the entire kingdom does not carve out an exception for the prophet who spoke it. The brook that has been keeping him alive is drying up precisely because the thing Elijah prayed for is happening. His own provision is being consumed by the very judgment he pronounced. Here is the fifth lesson, and it is the one that lands hardest for anyone who has ever done everything right and still watched the ground shift under them anyway. Elijah did not disobey. He did not wander off course or stop trusting the instructions he was given. He went exactly where he was told, did exactly what he was told. And the place that was supposed to sustain him is running out anyway. Obedience did not buy him an exemption from the consequences of the very drought he called down. If anything, it placed him directly inside it. You followed the instruction. You went where you were sent. And the resource you were counting on, the job, the relationship, the routine that used to hold everything together, started thinning out anyway, drop by drop, until you are left standing over dry stones, wondering what you did wrong. The honest answer, in Elijah's case, is nothing. He did nothing wrong. The brook was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to carry him through one season, and that season is ending. Not because God forgot about him, but because the next part of the plan requires him to be somewhere else. Elijah does not get this explanation in advance. He does not wake up one morning to a clear message saying the brook is about to dry up, so prepare yourself. He simply watches it happen. Day by day, the water retreating a little further each time he comes to drink, until eventually there is no pretending anymore. The place that fed him is gone, and it is only after the brook is fully dry, only after there is no water left to even measure the decline of, that the next instruction comes. The word of the Lord tells him to get up and go to a town called Zarephath, on the coast, inside the very territory Jezebel came from, and that a widow there has been commanded to provide for him. Notice the order of events here, because it carries the sixth lesson inside it. God does not move Elijah before the brook runs dry. He does not relocate him early out of some sense of fairness, sparing him the discomfort of watching his provision disappear in slow motion. Elijah is left to experience the full decline, every diminishing day of it, before the next door opens. The waiting is not a mistake in the story. It is the story. There is a kind of faith that only gets tested in dramatic, single moments. The kind that shows up once, demands a decision, and then resolves itself quickly one way or another. And there is another kind of faith, quieter and far less discussed, that gets tested in slow disappearance. In watching something you depend on shrink a little more each day with no clear end date attached to it. Elijah's time at Cherith is the second kind. There is no single crisis to rise to. There is only the long, grinding experience of watching the water level drop and choosing, morning after morning, to stay anyway, to keep drinking what is left, to keep trusting that the same God who sent the ravens has not simply walked away. He has not walked away, but he is also not in a hurry to explain himself. By the time Elijah leaves that ravine, he carries the seventh lesson with him. Though he could not have put it into words, yet the place that once fed you faithfully is allowed to stop being the place that feeds you. And that ending is not always a sign that something has gone wrong. Sometimes it is simply a sign that the next place is ready. And you only get to it once you stop expecting the old place to refill itself one more time. He picks himself up. He walks west, toward the coast, toward enemy territory, toward a widow who has no idea yet that a prophet of the God of Israel is about to walk into her life with nothing left of his own to offer her except a promise. The woman at the gate of Zarephath is gathering sticks, 2 of them, just enough to build one small fire. And she is doing the kind of math that nobody should ever have to do out loud. She has flour left in a jar, a small amount, and oil left in a jug, even smaller. And she has already decided, before Elijah ever reaches her, exactly how this is going to end. She is going to go home, use these 2 sticks to build one last fire, bake what little flour and oil she has into a single small loaf, share it with her son, and then the 2 of them are going to wait to die. This is not despair dressed up as drama. This is a woman doing simple arithmetic on what she has left and arriving at the only honest conclusion the numbers allow. Into this exact moment, Elijah arrives and asks her for water. She goes to get it without hesitation, because water, at least, she still has. But before she can walk away, he asks for something else, a piece of bread. And this is where her whole carefully held composure threatens to break. She tells him plainly what she just told herself in her own head moments earlier, that she has no bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug, and that she is gathering these 2 sticks so she can prepare this last meal for herself and her son before they die. There is nothing dramatic in how she says it. That is what makes it devastating. She is not weeping. She is not begging. She is simply stating a fact, the way you state a fact when you have already made peace with it. When the grief has worn down into something flatter and quieter than panic. This is just what is going to happen. And she has stopped expecting anyone to stop it. And Elijah tells her not to be afraid. And then he asks her to do the one thing that should sound completely unreasonable. Go ahead, he says, and make the bread the way you planned. But make a small loaf for me first, and bring it out to me. And after that, make something for yourself and your son, because the jar of flour will not run out, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the rain returns to the land. Consider what is being asked of her. This is not a comfortable request wrapped in safety. Elijah is asking a woman with almost nothing to give the first portion of that almost nothing to a stranger, before she feeds her own starving child. There is no visible guarantee attached to this. He has not performed any sign in front of her yet. He has not proven anything. He is simply a tired, dusty man standing at her gate, asking her to trust a promise about a jar and a jug that have given her no reason yet to believe they are about to behave any differently than they have been behaving for days. And she does it anyway. That decision holds the 8th lesson in it, and it deserves to be sat with longer than almost anything else in this chapter. This is not the response of someone who has plenty and can afford to be generous. This is the response of someone standing at the absolute edge of what she has, choosing to give away the very last of it on the word of a man she has just met. Whatever faith looks like in its rawest, least comfortable form. This is closer to it than almost anything else in this entire story. She goes home. She does what he said. And the flour does not run out. And the oil does not run dry. Day after day, she reaches into that jar, expecting to scrape the bottom. And day after day, there is enough. Not abundance. Not a sudden overflow that erases all memory of how close to empty she once was. Just enough. Repeated. Quietly. Without spectacle. For as many days as the famine lasts. There is no single dramatic miracle here. No flash of light. No voice from the sky. There is only a jar that keeps producing exactly what is needed. One day at a time, in a way that never lets her stockpile security, but never lets her starve either. This is the 9th lesson, and it is a different kind of provision than what Elijah experienced at the brook. The brook fed him until it stopped. The jar feeds the widow continuously, in a way that requires her to keep trusting it every single day instead of ever getting to relax into a surplus. Some seasons of provision come with an ending date built into them, and some seasons of provision come as a daily renewal that never quite lets you stop, depending on the source. Elijah, who just learned the lesson at Chariot, is now living next to someone learning this different one. And the two of them, prophet and widow, end up sustaining each other through different shapes of the same kind of faith. For a while, this becomes its own quiet life. Elijah staying in the widow's home, the jar holding, the oil holding, a household that had nothing, somehow not running out, day after day, while the rest of the land around them dries up exactly as Elijah said it would. And then her son gets sick. It is not gradual. The illness grows severe. His breathing becomes labored, and at some point there is no breath left in him at all. The same woman who had already once prepared herself to watch her child die of hunger now watches him die of something else entirely. After the famine had already been pushed back, after the jar had already proven itself faithful, after she had let herself believe, even slightly, that the worst was behind her, her grief, when it comes, is aimed directly at Elijah. She asks him what she has done to deserve this, whether he came into her house specifically to bring her sins back to her memory and kill her son as punishment for them. This is not a calm theological question. This is a mother standing in the wreckage of the one thing she had left, looking for somewhere to place an unbearable weight. And the only person close enough to absorb it is the prophet she had trusted with her last handful of flour. Elijah does not argue with her. He does not defend himself or explain. He simply takes the boy from her arms and carries him upstairs to the room where he has been staying, and lays him down, and then does something worth watching closely. He cries out to God, openly, with no composure or polish in his words, asking why this tragedy has been brought down on a woman who has already given him everything she had to give. He stretches himself out over the boy's body 3 times, praying that the life would return to him. And it does. The boy breathes again. Elijah carries him back downstairs and hands him to his mother. And her response is not relief exactly. Or not only relief. She tells Elijah that now she knows, beyond any remaining doubt, that he is a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in his mouth is truth. This is the 10th lesson, and it is easy to miss what actually convinced her. It was not the jar that never ran empty. It was not the months of quiet, steady provision that kept her and her son alive through the worst of the famine. What finally settled her faith was watching this prophet absorb her grief without defending himself, carry her dead child upstairs, and refuse to let the story end there. The miracle of provision had sustained her, but it was the miracle that happened after her deepest loss that convinced her. There is an 11th thing worth carrying forward out of this chapter. Something easy to miss if you only remember Elijah as the man who later calls down fire on a mountain in front of a watching nation. Before any of that, he spent a season being fed by an outcast bird, and then he spent another season being fed by a foreign widow who had nothing left to give. And somewhere inside that second season, he became the kind of man who would carry a dying child upstairs and refuse to let go of him. The prophet who is about to walk back into Ahab's kingdom is not the same man who walked out of it. He has been hidden, fed, emptied, and asked to give comfort out of his own near emptiness. None of that happened in front of a crowd. None of it will make it into the version of this story that people remember first. But it is the reason the version they do remember is even possible at all. 3 years pass between the moment Elijah leaves Zarephath and the moment he walks back into the open. And almost none of those years make it into the story at all. This is worth pausing on before moving forward, because 3 years is not a short stretch of time to simply skip over. 3 years of a drought that has by now stopped being an inconvenience and become a slow national catastrophe. The fields that should have been green have turned to cracked earth. The herds that once filled the hillsides have thinned to almost nothing. Families who once had food to spare are now watching their children grow hollow-cheeked. And the king of this nation is so desperate for any source of water and grass that he sends his own palace official out personally to search the land, rather than trusting the task to anyone less invested in the outcome. That official is a man named Obadiah, and before Elijah ever reappears, the story takes a detour to tell us something about him, and that detour carries the 12th lesson inside it. Obadiah serves in Ahab's own household, managing the king's affairs from a position close enough to power that he could have used it to protect only himself. Instead, the text tells us that years earlier, when Jezebel was hunting down and killing the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah had secretly taken 100 of them, hidden 50 at a time in 2 separate caves, and kept them alive on bread and water that he supplied at his own risk. For as long as the danger lasted, sit with what that actually required of him. Obadiah did not get to make one dramatic stand and walk away with his reputation intact. He had to keep showing up, day after day, carrying food into hiding places, maintaining a secret that could have ended his life the moment it was discovered, all while continuing to serve in the household of the very queen who was doing the killing. There was no audience for this kind of courage. No one was going to write songs about a palace official quietly keeping bread flowing to men in caves. If he had been caught, there would have been no trial, no public defense, nothing but a quiet and efficient execution. And the prophets in those caves would likely have starved without him ever being missed. Faithfulness does not always look like standing in front of a king and announcing a verdict. Elijah is about to become the version of faithfulness that gets remembered in Scripture and retold for thousands of years. Obadiah is the version that almost nobody else would have noticed. And the text takes the time to make sure we notice it anyway. It is this same Obadiah, out searching the land for any remaining patch of grass that might keep the king's horses and mules alive, who runs directly into Elijah on the road. Obadiah recognizes him immediately, and his reaction is not relief. It is closer to fear. He falls to the ground and asks Elijah directly whether it is really him. And when Elijah confirms it, Obadiah's next words reveal exactly how dangerous this moment actually is. He tells Elijah that Ahab has searched every nation and every kingdom looking for him these past 3 years, demanding that any ruler who claimed not to have found him swear an oath to that effect. Because Ahab was that desperate to locate the man who shut off the sky. And now Obadiah is being asked to walk back to Ahab and announce that Elijah has been found. Obadiah's fear here is not cowardice. It is the entirely reasonable fear of a man who has survived this long precisely by being careful, and who knows that the moment he tells Ahab where Elijah is, he is staking his own life on Elijah actually being there when the king arrives. He says as much directly. He tells Elijah that the moment he leaves to deliver this message, the Spirit of the Lord might carry Elijah off somewhere else entirely. And when Ahab comes and does not find him, Obadiah himself will be the one who pays for it with his life. After everything he has already survived to keep faithful men alive in secret for years. This is a man asking, quite reasonably, not to be made a casualty of someone else's bold moment. Elijah's response to this is simple and direct. He swears to Obadiah, by the life of the very God they both serve, that he will present himself to Ahab that very day. There is no lengthy reassurance here, no elaborate promise, just a vow, given plainly, to a man who has every right to be afraid, and who needs something solid to stand on before he is willing to risk everything on Elijah's word. Obadiah goes, and Elijah keeps his word. When Ahab finally sees Elijah standing in front of him again after 3 years, his first words are an accusation. He calls Elijah the one who has brought trouble on Israel, the one responsible for everything the nation has suffered during the drought. This accusation carries the 13th lesson, and it deserves to be examined closely, because it is one of the oldest patterns in any story about telling the truth to power, and it is going to repeat itself in different forms for as long as people keep speaking uncomfortable realities out loud. Ahab is not entirely wrong that trouble has come. He is simply wrong about where the trouble actually started. The drought did not begin with Elijah's words at the palace door 3 years earlier. It began with a kingdom that had already, quietly and gradually, traded its devotion for convenience, building altars to Baal alongside its claims of faithfulness, letting compromise settle into its bones until it no longer noticed the difference. Elijah did not create that condition. He simply named it out loud, and the moment he did, he became, in Ahab's mind, the source of the very crisis his words had only exposed. Elijah does not flinch from this accusation, and his response is the kind of clarity that the rest of this story is going to depend on. He tells Ahab plainly that it is not Elijah who has troubled Israel, but Ahab himself and his father's household. By abandoning the commands of the Lord and following after Baal instead, there is no apology in this response, no softening, no attempt to find some middle ground that lets Ahab save face while Elijah quietly retreats. He states the truth as plainly as he stated the drought 3 years earlier, standing in the same kind of dangerous exposure. Except this time, there is no brook to disappear to afterward. This time, Elijah does not walk away. He stays. And he gives Ahab an instruction. Gather, he says, all of Israel to Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Bring everyone, bring everything this compromised kingdom has been quietly building its faith on for years, and bring it out into the open where it can finally be seen for exactly what it is. Here is the 14th lesson. Sitting quietly underneath everything that has happened in this chapter. There is more than one way to be faithful, and this story has just shown you both of them side by side. Elijah confronts a king in the open, at enormous personal risk, and his name survives for thousands of years because of it. Obadiah spends years feeding hidden prophets in caves, at exactly the same risk, and almost nobody remembers his name at all. The story does not rank one above the other. It simply lets you see that the quiet, hidden kind of courage and the loud, public kind of courage are both the real thing, even though only one of them ever gets remembered by history. Ahab agrees to gather everyone. Word goes out across the kingdom, and somewhere on a mountain that has not yet seen what is about to happen on it, the ground is waiting for a confrontation that an entire nation has been avoiding for years without ever fully admitting it to themselves. The crowd that gathers on Mount Carmel is not made up of villains. This is worth saying clearly before the fire falls, because it is easy to imagine this scene as a battle between obvious good and obvious evil. The righteous prophet against the wicked nation. The truth sitting in that crowd is far more familiar and far more uncomfortable than that. These are ordinary people. Farmers and merchants and parents who have watched their children go hungry for 3 straight years, who still consider themselves believers in the God of Israel, and who have also, somewhere along the way, started hedging their bets with Baal, because Baal was supposed to control the rain, and the rain had not come. And desperation makes people willing to try almost anything that might work. Elijah stands in front of this crowd, along with the 450 prophets of Baal that Ahab gathered, and he asks them a question that carries the 15th lesson inside it. How long? He asks them. Will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. Notice what he does not say. He does not open with condemnation. He does not call them faithless or stupid or beyond saving. He simply names, out loud, in front of everyone, the exact thing they have all been quietly doing for years without ever having to admit it to themselves or to each other. They have been trying to keep one foot in each world, claiming loyalty to God while building insurance policies with Baal. And Elijah is asking them, plainly, to finally pick one. The people say nothing. This silence is one of the most important details in the entire chapter, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. This is not a defiant silence, the kind that comes from people who have made their choice and are simply refusing to announce it. This is the silence of people who genuinely do not know what they believe anymore, who have lived inside a comfortable blur for so long that the question itself catches them completely unprepared. They cannot answer Elijah, because answering would require them to admit, out loud, that they have not actually been choosing anything at all. They have just been drifting, hoping nobody would ever ask them to clarify exactly where they stood. Elijah lays out the terms of what comes next. 2 bulls will be prepared, one for the prophets of Baal and one for himself, each cut into pieces and placed on wood, with no fire lit underneath either one. The prophets of Baal will call on the name of their God, and Elijah will call on the name of the Lord. And whichever one answers by sending down fire will be recognized by everyone watching as the one true God. The crowd agrees that this is a fair test, and the prophets of Baal go first. What follows is a long, grueling stretch of time, and it should not be rushed through the way a highlight reel might rush through it. The prophets of Baal call out to their God from morning until noon, and nothing happens. No fire, no response of any kind. Eliach, watching this unfold, begins to mock them, suggesting that perhaps Baal is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling somewhere, or even sleeping, and that they should shout louder to wake him up. This is sharp, almost merciless sarcasm, and it is worth understanding why Elijah allows himself to use it here. After years of watching this nation hedge its bets on a God that has done nothing for them, he is finally allowed to say, in front of everyone, exactly how empty that hedging has been. The prophets of Baal respond by shouting louder, and then by cutting themselves with swords and spears, according to their custom, until blood flows from their bodies, all in a desperate attempt to provoke some response from a God who never answers. This continues into the afternoon. The sun moves across the sky. Nothing happens. No voice. No fire. No sign of any kind. Only 450 exhausted, bleeding men shouting at an empty heaven that gives them nothing back. Then it is Elijah's turn. He does not rush into it either. He calls the people closer, repairs the altar of the Lord that had been torn down, taking 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes descended from Jacob. A deliberate reminder, placed right there in front of everyone, that this was never about one prophet's personal faith. This was about the entire nation, all 12 tribes, and the God who had claimed them as his own long before any of them were born. He digs a trench around the altar. He places the wood and the cut pieces of the bull on top, and then he does something that makes absolutely no strategic sense if his goal was simply to win a contest. He orders 4 large jars filled with water and poured over the offering and the wood. Then he orders it done a second time, then a third time, until the water is running down off the altar and filling the trench around it completely. This is the 16th lesson, and it is easy to walk past without noticing it. There is no ambiguity left after this. No possibility that someone in the crowd could later claim a hidden spark or a clever trick produced what happens next. Elijah has deliberately made the test as difficult as it can possibly be. Soaked the wood until it would seem nearly impossible for it to catch fire at all, because what he is about to ask for needs to be unmistakable to everyone watching. Real faith does not need to stack the odds in its own favor. It can afford to make the test harder, not easier, because it is not actually resting on the test at all. He steps forward and prays, and the prayer itself is remarkably short, especially compared to the hours the prophets of Baal spent shouting and bleeding for a response that never came. He asks that it be known this day that the Lord is God in Israel, and that Elijah is his servant, and that all of this has been done at his command, so that the people will know that the Lord is God, and that he is turning their hearts back to himself. That is the whole prayer. No theatrics, no desperate volume, just a clear, direct request, spoken once, and the fire of the Lord falls. It does not simply ignite the wood, it consumes the offering, the wood, the stones of the altar itself, the dust around it, and licks up every drop of water that had been poured into the trench, leaving nothing behind but scorched, empty ground, where moments earlier there had been a soaked, deliberately impossible offering. The people, watching this happen, fall on their faces, and they say, with one voice, that the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. This is the 17th lesson, and it is the whole reason this mountain has waited 3 years for this exact afternoon. Not the drought itself, not the suffering it caused, but this, the moment an entire crowd of people who had been quietly hedging between two faiths finally watches the question answered in a way that leaves no more room for ambiguity. The silence that met Elijah's question at the start of this chapter has been replaced by a single unified voice. And for one suspended moment on top of this mountain, an entire nation appears to have come home. Elijah does not let the moment end in celebration alone. He orders the prophets of Baal seized, and they are brought down to the valley below and put to death there. A judgment carried out according to the standards of that ancient covenant world. Severe by any measure, and worth sitting with rather than rushing past. This is the 18th lesson, though it is an uncomfortable one. This is not the version of faith that softens easily into something comfortable for modern sensibilities. The mountain is not only the place where fire fell, it is also the place where the false prophets who had led an entire nation astray for years finally faced the full weight of what their false worship had cost. By the time the sun begins to set, Elijah has done everything that needed doing. He has confronted a nation's divided heart, watched fire fall from a clear sky, witnessed a crowd return to faith in a single unified voice, and overseen the end of the prophets who led them away from it. By any reasonable measure, this should be the high point of his entire life. Here is the 19th lesson, and it is the one the rest of this story is going to spend a long time proving true. A moment, this enormous, is not the end of the story. It is barely the middle of it. And the very next thing that happens to this man, who has just witnessed heaven itself answer his prayer, is not celebration. It is exhaustion so deep it will nearly kill him. The valley below Mount Carmel is quiet now. The way a place gets quiet after something enormous has just finished happening in it. Elijah turns to Ahab, who has watched all of this unfold from somewhere near the edge of the crowd, and tells him to go up, eat, and drink, because there is the sound of a heavy rain coming. This is a strange thing to say out loud, because there is no sound of rain anywhere. The sky overhead is the same dry, cloudless sky that has hung over this land for 3 years. Ahab goes to eat and drink, presumably because there is little else to do, and Elijah climbs to the very top of Carmel, where he bends down to the ground and puts his face between his knees. This posture carries the 20th lesson inside it. It is not the posture of a man celebrating a victory. It is closer to the posture of someone bracing for impact, folding himself down small, the way a person curls in on themselves when they are praying with everything they have left. Elijah has just spent the day standing tall in front of an entire nation, mocking false prophets, calling down fire from a clear sky. Now, alone at the top of the mountain, he folds himself almost in half and prays for the one thing he announced was already on its way. Even the man who just watched fire fall still has to wrestle the next promise out of heaven, one prayer at a time. He tells his servant to go look toward the sea. The servant goes, looks, and comes back with nothing to report. There is nothing there. He says, no clouds, no sign of anything changing in that vast dry sky. Elijah sends him back. 7 times this happens. 7 times the servant walks to the edge of the mountain, looks out toward the water, and comes back with the same report, that there is nothing there. It would have been so easy for Elijah to stop after the 2nd or 3rd report and decide that perhaps he had misunderstood something, that the rain was not actually coming after all, that the words he had spoken to Ahab had been premature. He does not stop. He sends the servant back again and again. After a victory, this enormous, into a sky that keeps giving him nothing in return. On the 7th trip, the servant returns with something different to say. There is a cloud, he reports, small, no bigger than a man's hand, rising up out of the sea. That is all it is. A single small cloud. Easy to miss if you were not looking for it. The kind of detail that could pass unnoticed by anyone who was not standing on a mountain specifically waiting for it to appear. But Elijah does not treat it as a small thing. And this is the 21st lesson. He immediately sends word to Ahab to prepare his chariot and head down before the rain stops him, because he has seen enough. One small cloud, after 7 empty reports in a row, is all the confirmation he needs. Answered prayer rarely arrives all at once. It arrives the size of a hand, and the only difference between missing it and catching it is whether you kept sending the servant back. The sky darkens quickly after that. Wind picks up. Heavy clouds gather and pile on top of each other, where moments earlier there had been nothing at all. And then the rain finally comes. A real and heavy rain. The kind this land has not felt in 3 full years. Falling on cracked fields and empty riverbeds, and people who had nearly forgotten what the sound of it was like. Something happens to Elijah in that moment that carries the 22nd lesson, because it tells you something about what this victory actually cost him and what it gave back. The power of the Lord comes on him, and he ties up his cloak and runs ahead of Ahab's chariot, the whole distance back to the entrance of a city called Jezreel, outrunning a king's horses on foot the entire way. This is the last moment in the story where Elijah is shown moving with this kind of strength. He is, in this instant, the version of himself that the rest of history will remember best. The prophet who called fire from heaven and then outran a king's chariot through the falling rain that proved he had been right all along. If the story ended here, it would end as a triumph, clean and uncomplicated. Exactly the kind of ending people prefer. The story does not end here, because somewhere in the city ahead of him, a message is already being prepared. And the man who just outran a king on foot is about to discover that there is a kind of exhaustion no amount of strength can outrun. Ahab tells Jezebel everything, every detail of what happened on the mountain. The prophets of Baal exposed and humiliated, the fire that fell, the 450 dead by the time the day was over. He leaves nothing out. Jezebel's response arrives at Elijah in the form of a message, carried by a messenger sent specifically to deliver it. And the message is brutally simple. She swears, by her own gods, that by this time tomorrow she will have done to Elijah exactly what he did to her prophets. His life, she promises, will end the same way theirs did. Here is the 23rd lesson. And it sits inside a contrast that is the whole reason this chapter exists. This is not an army marching toward Elijah. This is not soldiers surrounding him on the road, or a formal arrest, or any kind of physical danger arriving in front of him where he can see it and respond to it directly. This is a sentence, a threat carried by a single messenger. Words on the air. Nothing more substantial than that. And it breaks him completely. The man who stood unflinching in front of Ahab 3 years earlier and announced a drought with total composure. The man who walked back into that same palace after 3 years in hiding and accused the king to his face of leading Israel astray. The man who stood on a mountain in front of 450 prophets and an entire watching nation, soaked the offering in water 3 times over just to make the miracle harder, and prayed once, briefly, with total confidence that fire would fall. That man receives one threatening message from a queen who has not laid a single hand on him. And he runs. He runs into the wilderness, alone, leaving even his servant behind in Beersheba, traveling another full day's journey by himself into open desert with no plan, no destination, nothing but the need to put distance between himself and the message he just received. And when he finally stops, under a single broom tree, in the middle of all that emptiness, he sits down and asks God to let him die. "It is enough," he says. "Take my life. I am no better than the ones who came before me." This is the same man, only days removed from the greatest spiritual victory of his entire life. And it would be easy to read this moment as some kind of failure, a collapse of faith after such an enormous demonstration of it. Here is the 24th lesson, and it is worth slowing all the way down for. That reading misses something important about how exhaustion actually works in a human body and a human spirit. Consider what Elijah's body and mind had just absorbed in a short span of days. Years of hiding, by a brook and then in a widow's home, finally giving way to the most public, most confrontational, most physically and emotionally demanding day of his entire life. Standing for hours in front of a hostile crowd, mocking 450 prophets who wanted him dead, watching them cut themselves with swords in increasing desperation. Praying once, with everything riding on a single moment, and watching fire answer him in front of everyone, then ordering the execution of every one of those prophets himself, then running on foot, faster than a king's chariot, for the better part of an afternoon, through rain after 3 dry years. Here is the 25th lesson. And it may be the single most important insight in this entire story. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not arrive during the crisis itself. It arrives after. Once the adrenaline that carried you through the hardest moment finally drains out of your body and leaves you with nothing underneath it but how tired you actually are. Soldiers describe this. People who have just survived a medical emergency describe this. Anyone who has pushed through an enormous, the high-stakes moment on pure adrenaline knows that the real collapse rarely happens during the danger. It happens afterward, in the quiet, when there is finally permission to stop holding everything together. Elijah is not falling apart because his faith failed on the mountain. His faith did not fail on the mountain. It is collapsing now, in the empty space after the victory, because his body and his spirit have finally been given room to feel everything they were not allowed to feel while he still had a task in front of him. And then there is the threat itself, which carries the 26th lesson. Jezebel's message did not announce an army. It announced a single, specific, personal intention, that she would see him dead within a day. And there is something about a threat aimed directly and personally at you that can reach a part of the mind that a larger, more abstract danger never touches. Elijah had just confronted an entire system, a king, a religion, hundreds of false prophets, and walked through all of it without flinching. One woman's personal vow to kill him by tomorrow finds the one door none of that previous courage had been built to guard. Notice, too, what Elijah says under that tree. I am no better than my fathers. He tells God, as though his exhaustion has rewritten the last several years of his own story in front of him. The man who just watched fire fall from heaven is now convinced he has accomplished nothing, that he is no different from anyone who came before him and failed. Here is the 27th lesson. This is what real exhaustion does to memory. It does not simply make you tired. It reaches backward and distorts everything you have already survived, convincing you that none of it actually mattered. He believes, sitting under that tree, that he is utterly alone, the last faithful person left in an entire unfaithful nation. This belief is not true, and the story will eventually correct it directly. But the 28th lesson is worth naming here on its own. Isolation has a way of doing this to a person. The less support someone feels they have around them, the more convinced they become that there genuinely is none left to find, even when that conviction does not match reality at all. This is the man lying under the broom tree at the start of this story. And now you understand exactly how he got there. Not because his faith was thin, not because the victory on Carmel was somehow false or incomplete. He got there because he is human. Because a body and a spirit can only sustain so much before they need somewhere to set the weight down. And because nobody, not even a man who has just watched heaven answer his prayer with fire, is exempt from that kind of limit. He asks to die under that tree. And then, worn completely through, he falls asleep. What happens next is not a lecture about strength. It is not a reminder of everything he just accomplished, or a call to get back up and keep fighting. It begins with something far simpler, something almost startling in how little it asks of him. It begins with a hand, gently touching his shoulder, waking him only long enough to tell him to eat. The hand on his shoulder does not arrive with a rebuke. Here is the 29th lesson, and it changes the shape of everything that follows. It would have been so easy for this next scene to open differently. Elijah is, after all, a prophet who just asked to die after watching the greatest miracle of his life. There would be a kind of logic to a story that opened this next scene with questions, with God asking Elijah to account for his sudden collapse, to explain how a man who just saw fire fall from heaven could fall apart over a single threatening message. That is not what happens. What happens is an angel touches him and tells him to get up and eat. Elijah opens his eyes, and there beside him is bread, baked over hot coals, and a jar of water sitting close enough that he does not even have to move far to reach it. He eats, he drinks, and then he lies back down and falls asleep again. The order of events here carries the 30th lesson. God does not begin this encounter with words at all. He begins it with food and rest, provided without explanation. Before a single question is asked or a single correction is offered, the first thing Elijah receives after his collapse is not a lecture. It is care for a body that has been pushed past what it could sustain. There is a temptation, when reading stories like this one, to assume that spiritual exhaustion needs to be solved with spiritual answers. That what someone in Elijah's position truly needs is a renewed sense of purpose, a fresh reminder of all that God has done, a recommitment to the calling that brought him this far. God does not offer any of that yet. He offers sleep. He offers bread. He treats the body as something worth tending to before the soul is asked to explain itself. And there is a tenderness in that order that carries the 31st lesson forward on its own. The angel returns a second time. Elijah wakes again to find the same provision waiting. And this time, the angel tells him something more specific, that the journey ahead of him is too much for him to handle in his current state. Get up and eat. The message says, because there is still a long way to go. This detail matters more than it first appears to. And it is the 32nd lesson. God does not pretend that Elijah's exhaustion is the end of his usefulness. There is still a journey ahead of him. Still a purpose waiting on the other side of this collapse. But God also does not rush him toward it. He acknowledges, plainly, that Elijah, in his current condition, cannot make that journey. And rather than demanding he push through anyway, God simply provides what is needed to make the journey possible later. When Elijah is actually ready for it, Elijah eats a second time. And on the strength of that food, he gets up and walks for 40 days and 40 nights, all the way to Horeb, the mountain of God. This number deserves a small pause, because it is not the first time it has appeared in this larger story. 40 days and nights is the same span of time tied to other major moments of transition and preparation throughout Scripture. Periods of testing or waiting that come before something significant is about to happen. Whether or not Elijah himself was thinking of any of that as he walked, the pattern is there for anyone reading closely. This is not simply a long walk. It is the kind of journey that marks the space between one chapter of a life ending and another one beginning. But there is something here worth naming as its own lesson. The 33rd. Elijah did not earn this journey through renewed strength of his own. He did not pull himself back together through sheer determination and then set off toward Horeb under his own power. The text is specific about this. He walked in the strength of that food, the same food provided to him while he was at his lowest, asking to die, offering nothing in return except his exhausted, sleeping body for God to tend to. There is no dramatic turning point here. No single moment where Elijah suddenly finds his resolve again and stands back up on his own. There is only an angel, twice, offering food and rest without conditions, and a man walking 40 days on the strength of provisions he did nothing to deserve and everything to need. By the time Elijah reaches Horeb, he has had over a month of walking, alone, through open country, with nothing but his own thoughts and the slow rhythm of one foot after another to keep him company. Whatever healing happened in those 40 days happened quietly, off the page, in the kind of unremarkable repetition that rarely makes it into the parts of a story people remember. No miracles are recorded during this stretch. No further angelic visits. Just a man walking, fed once, twice, and then sustained for over a month by what that provision gave him. He arrives at the mountain and finds a cave, and goes inside it to spend the night. And it is there, in that cave, after the bread and the rest and the long, silent walk that brought him this far, that the next voice he hears is not an angel offering food. It is God himself, asking him a question that Elijah is not yet ready to answer honestly. The question comes simply, without any introduction or build-up. What are you doing here? Elijah. Here is the 34th lesson. And it is easy to walk past if you are not paying attention. God already knows the answer. This is not a question asked because information is missing. It is the kind of question a parent asks a child who is sitting alone in the dark. Not because they need to be told what happened, but because they want to hear the child say it out loud, to give shape to whatever is sitting unspoken inside them. Elijah answers, and his answer reveals exactly how far the exhaustion has reached into how he sees his entire situation. He says he has been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, because the people of Israel have abandoned the covenant, torn down the altars, killed the prophets with the sword, and that he alone is left. And now they are seeking his life as well, to take it from him. Listen to what is buried inside that answer, because it is the 35th lesson. Every part of it traces back to real events. Israel had abandoned much of the covenant. Altars had been torn down. Prophets had been killed. Jezebel really was seeking his life. None of the facts are wrong, but the conclusion built on top of those facts, that he alone is left, that he is utterly and completely isolated in his faithfulness, is not actually true. And the rest of this scene exists specifically to correct it. Exhaustion does not usually invent lies out of nothing. It takes things that are genuinely true. Real losses, real threats, real isolation in certain ways, and then stitches them together into a story that goes further than the facts actually support. God's response to this does not begin with correction. It begins with an instruction. Go out, he tells Elijah, and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord. And then something happens that carries the 36th lesson inside its very order. A great and powerful wind tears through the mountain, strong enough to break rocks apart in front of the Lord. And the Lord was not in the wind. Then an earthquake shakes the ground. And again, the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then fire moves across the mountain. And again, the Lord was not in the fire. This last detail deserves particular attention, because it would be easy to misread it if you are not paying close enough attention. This is not a story declaring that God is never present in dramatic, powerful displays. Days earlier, on Carmel, fire fell from a clear sky exactly because God sent it. And an entire watching nation fell on its face because of what that fire proved. God was unmistakably present in that fire. The point being made at Horeb is that God is not limited to the spectacular, that he cannot be reduced to only the version of himself that announces its arrival with enough force to be impossible to miss. After the fire, there is a sound. The original language describes it as a thin silence, sometimes rendered as a gentle whisper, sometimes as the sound of a low murmur, but the image underneath all of those translations is the same. After wind and earthquake and fire, something arrives that is almost the opposite of all three. Something quiet enough that a person would have to be paying very close attention to even notice it was there at all. And it is there, in that quiet, that Elijah finally covers his face with his cloak and goes out to stand at the entrance of the cave. Here is the 37th lesson, and it may be the tenderest one in the whole story. Not the wind, not the earthquake, not the fire. Despite the fact that fire is exactly what convinced an entire nation of God's reality only days earlier. It is the thin silence that finally draws him out of hiding. the same man who had just witnessed the most dramatic display of divine power in his lifetime. Now, responding most fully to something almost too quiet to notice. A man who watched heaven answer with fire is, days later, met not with more fire, but with a silence gentle enough to finally coax him out of the cave he has been hiding in. God asks the same question again. What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah gives the exact same answer, word for word, that he gave before the wind and the earthquake and the fire and the silence. Nothing about his internal story has changed yet. Despite everything he just witnessed, he is still convinced he is utterly alone. Still convinced the covenant has been entirely abandoned. Still convinced his own life is the last thing standing between faithfulness and total collapse. This repetition carries the 38th lesson. It would have been simple for the story to show Elijah transformed instantly by the encounter with the thin silence. Suddenly, seeing his situation clearly and responding with renewed confidence. That is not what happens. He says the same words again. Because exhaustion this deep does not get resolved by a single moment of quiet. However meaningful that moment was, sometimes a person needs to be met gently more than once before the story they have been telling themselves finally starts to shift. This time, God answers him directly. And the answer does two things at once. First, he gives Elijah a new set of instructions. Tasks waiting for him beyond this mountain. Anointing new kings over 2 different nations. And anointing a successor, a man named Elisha, to carry the work of a prophet forward. There is still a future. There is still a role for Elijah to play in it. And then, almost as an afterthought, but really as the most important correction in the entire scene, God tells him something Elijah had no way of knowing on his own. There are 7,000 people left in Israel. God says, who have never bowed the knee to Baal, whose lips have never kissed his image in worship. 7,000. Elijah believed he was alone. He was not even close to alone. There were thousands of faithful people scattered across the very nation he believed had completely abandoned its God, living quietly, unnoticed, never making it into any story that would be remembered the way Elijah's story would be remembered. And Elijah had no idea any of them existed. God does not rebuke Elijah for believing the lie of his isolation. He simply tells him the truth. Gently, the same way the thin silence arrived gently, correcting a story that exhaustion had convinced Elijah was complete and accurate, without ever shaming him for having believed it in the first place. Elijah leaves that cave a different man than the one who walked into it. Not because the wind or the earthquake or the fire changed him, but because a silence quiet enough to be almost missed finally reached a place inside him that none of the louder things could touch. And because a number he never expected to hear, 7,000, quietly dismantled the loneliest lie he had been carrying since the moment Jezebel's message reached him under that broom tree. He came to this mountain believing he was the last one standing. He leaves it knowing he was never standing alone at all. Elijah leaves Horeb carrying instructions instead of despair. And the first one he acts on leads him to a field where a young man is plowing with 12 yoke of oxen ahead of him. The young man's name is Elisha. And there is no introduction here either. No backstory explaining who his family is or why he was chosen out of everyone else in the land. He is simply a man at work, driving the 12th pair of oxen while 11 other pairs move along ahead of him. The kind of detail that tells you, without needing to say it directly, that this is a family with real wealth, real land, real standing, Whatever Elisha is about to leave behind, he is not leaving behind nothing. Elijah walks up to him without a word of explanation and throws his cloak over Elisha's shoulders, then keeps walking. That is the entire gesture. No speech, no formal ceremony, no announcement of what this means or what it is asking of him. Just a cloak, thrown across a working man's shoulders in the middle of a field, and a prophet who keeps moving as though the message has already been delivered in full. And somehow, it has been. Elisha understands immediately what just happened. He leaves the oxen standing in the field and runs after Elijah. And what he asks for next reveals something important about how he is choosing to step into this calling. He asks for permission to go back and kiss his father and mother goodbye first, before he follows. Elijah's response is brief and, on the surface, almost dismissive. Go back, he tells him. For what have I done to you? But the way Elisha responds to that permission shows he understood it as exactly the blessing it was meant to be. He goes back, but he does not simply say goodbye and walk away quietly. He takes the yoke of oxen he had just been plowing with, slaughters them, and uses the wood from the plowing equipment itself to build a fire and cook the meat, then gives it to the people of his town to eat. Only after that does he get up and follow Elijah, to serve him. Here is the 39th lesson, and it is worth sitting with. Elisha does not simply leave his old life behind quietly, keeping the door open in case the calling does not work out the way he hopes. He destroys the very tools of that old life, burns the wood of his own plow, kills the oxen he had just been working with, and turns what remains into a meal shared with his entire community. There is no path back to the field he just walked away from. He has made absolutely certain of that himself. Before he ever takes a single step toward the life Elijah is calling him into, this matters for what it tells us about the kind of successor Elijah is being given. He is not receiving an apprentice who is hedging his bets, keeping one option open while testing out another. He is receiving someone who burns the plow before the journey even begins. But step back from Elisha for a moment and consider what this entire encounter means for Elijah himself. Because this is where the 40th lesson sits. And it may be the most personal one in this whole chapter. Only recently, under that broom tree, and then again in the cave at Horeb, Elijah believed he was the last faithful person left in the entire nation. God had already corrected part of that lie at Horeb, telling him about the 7,000 who had never bowed to Baal. Now God is correcting it again, in a more personal and immediate way, by placing directly in front of Elijah a specific person who is going to continue the work after him. There is a particular kind of mercy in this worth naming clearly. Part of healing from deep exhaustion is not simply being told, in the abstract, that you are not alone. It is being shown, concretely, a person, a face, a name, someone who will still be standing and still be faithful after you are gone, doing the work you believed only you could carry. Elijah did not just receive an abstract reassurance on that mountain. He received an actual successor, walking beside him now, learning to serve him, preparing to inherit everything Elijah has spent his entire life building. This does not mean Elijah's work is finished. Elisha begins by serving Elijah, not by replacing him outright. There are still years of ministry ahead for the older prophet, still confrontations waiting, still a final, dramatic ending still to come. But something has shifted in a way that matters enormously for a man who recently believed his death would mean the end of everything he had given his life to. He is no longer carrying this alone. He has not been carrying it alone for some time. In fact, surrounded by 7,000 faithful strangers he never knew existed. But now, for the first time, he has someone walking right beside him, close enough to see, close enough to teach, close enough to trust with what comes next. Here is the 41st lesson, and it belongs to anyone who has ever believed, in their own lowest moment, that everything they built would simply end with them, that no one else cared enough or understood enough to carry it forward. Sometimes that belief is corrected slowly, abstractly, the way Elijah first learned about the 7,000, and sometimes it is corrected directly, specifically, with an actual person placed in your path who is willing to burn their own plow behind them in order to walk beside you. Elijah keeps walking, and Elisha keeps following. And for a while, the work continues with 2 men instead of 1. But there is one more confrontation waiting before this story reaches its end. And it is not a confrontation about silence or exhaustion or even fire from heaven. It is about a vineyard, and a king who wanted something that was never his to take. There is a small vineyard sitting beside Ahab's palace in Jezreel, and it belongs to a man named Naboth. Ahab wants it, not out of cruelty exactly, not at first. He wants it for something almost mundane by comparison to everything else in this story. A vegetable garden. Since the vineyard happens to sit conveniently close to his own house, he goes to Naboth directly and offers to trade him a better vineyard somewhere else, or to simply pay him whatever the land is worth in silver. This sounds, on the surface, like a reasonable offer from a king to one of his subjects. But Naboth refuses, and the reason he gives carries weight that a modern reader can easily miss if they do not understand what land actually meant in that world. "The Lord forbid," he tells Ahab, "that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." This was not simply property to Naboth. Land in Israel was tied directly to family inheritance, passed down through generations as part of a covenant relationship with God himself, never meant to be permanently sold off or traded away on a king's convenience. Refusing Ahab was not stubbornness. It was Naboth honoring an obligation that ran deeper than any price the king could offer him. Ahab's response to this refusal reveals exactly how thin his own character is underneath the power he holds. He does not argue or press the point further. He simply goes home, lies down on his bed, turns his face to the wall, and refuses to eat, sulking like a child who has been told he cannot have something he wants. It is Jezebel who finds him like this, and her response moves immediately from sympathy to action. She asks him why his spirit is so crushed that he will not eat. And when he explains about Naboth's refusal, she does not comfort him or counsel patience. She simply tells him to get up, eat, and let his heart be glad, because she will get him the vineyard of Naboth herself. What follows is one of the coldest, most calculated abuses of power in this entire story. Jezebel writes letters in Ahab's name, sealed with his own royal seal, and sends them to the elders and nobles of Naboth's own town. The instructions are explicit. Proclaim a fast. Seat Naboth in a prominent place among the people. Then bring in 2 corrupt witnesses to publicly accuse him of cursing God and the king, charges carrying the penalty of death. Once the accusation is made, the instructions continue. Take Naboth outside the city and stone him. The elders and nobles of the town, the very people who should have protected one of their own neighbors, carry out these instructions exactly as written. Naboth is publicly accused, dragged outside the city, and stoned to death, all under the cover of a religious fast that should have been a moment of communal devotion, twisted instead into the staging ground for a judicial murder. When Jezebel hears that Naboth is dead, she goes to Ahab and tells him simply to get up and take possession of the vineyard. The man refused to sell him. Since Naboth is no longer alive to stand in his way, Ahab gets up and goes down to claim it. This is the moment Elijah re-enters the story, sent by the word of the Lord to meet Ahab exactly where he has gone, to take what was never his. When Ahab sees him standing there in the vineyard he just claimed for himself, his first words carry a weary, almost resigned recognition. "Have you found me, my enemy?" he asks, as though some part of him already knew. This confrontation was inevitable the moment he chose to take what belonged to a dead man's family. Elijah's answer is direct and without softening. "I have found you," he says, "because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord." And then he pronounces a judgment specific to the crime itself, that in the very place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will also lick up Ahab's blood, a consequence shaped precisely to match the offense. Blood for blood, in the exact location where the injustice was carried out. Here is the 40-second lesson, and it connects this entire chapter back to everything Elijah experienced on Horeb. This is not the same man who once stood in front of an entire nation calling down fire from a clear sky in front of thousands of witnesses. This is a man who recently asked to die under a tree, who was fed by an angel, who walked 40 days in near silence, who finally heard God correct the loneliest lie he had ever believed about himself. And here he is again, standing alone in front of a king, delivering a hard and unwelcome truth with no crowd present to support him. No fire falling from the sky to validate his words in front of a watching audience. This is what restoration actually looks like once the dramatic mountaintop moment has passed. Elijah was not healed at Horeb so that he could retire quietly into a life of personal peace. He was healed so that he could keep doing exactly this, standing in front of unjust power and naming it for what it is, even when there is no crowd to fall on their faces afterward, even when the confrontation is small and personal rather than national and spectacular. Here is the 43rd lesson, and it is easy to miss if you are only looking for the dramatic scenes. There is a temptation, when telling stories about people who have burned out and been restored, to imagine that restoration means an end to difficulty, a permanent return to ease and comfort. Elijah's story refuses that ending. He is restored not into comfort, but back into the same kind of costly faithfulness that exhausted him in the first place. Except now he carries it differently. He is no longer carrying it alone, with Elisha walking somewhere behind him, learning the weight of this calling firsthand. And he is no longer carrying it without the knowledge that thousands of others remain faithful alongside him, even when he cannot see them standing there. This confrontation in the vineyard is, in its own way, just as important as anything that happened on Carmel or at Horeb. Even though it will never be remembered with the same scale or drama, it shows what a person looks like after they have been honestly rebuilt. Not invincible, not immune to future exhaustion, but capable again of standing in front of power and telling the truth. Because the silence at Horeb did not erase his calling. It simply made him able to carry it forward without the lie of total isolation distorting everything he saw. Ahab, hearing the full weight of Elijah's judgment, does something unexpected. He tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth, fasts, and walks around in evident humility and grief over what he has done. And the word of the Lord comes to Elijah again, acknowledging that because Ahab has humbled himself this way, the full disaster pronounced against his household will not arrive during his own lifetime, but will come in the days of his son instead. Here is the 44th lesson, tucked into the closing of this chapter almost as an afterthought, though it deserves more weight than that. Ahab had at least once been brought low enough to tremble under the word of the Lord. Even here, in the middle of judgment, this severe, there is room left for genuine repentance to soften what comes next. Ahab's humility does not erase the consequences of what he allowed Jezebel to do, but it does delay them. A reminder that even the worst chapters of a person's story are not entirely closed to the possibility of a different ending. Right up until the very end, Elijah leaves that vineyard having spoken the truth one more time. In a moment, with no crowd and no fire, just a king's guilty face and the blood of an innocent man still marking the ground beneath them both. There is one more fire still waiting in this story. And after that, one final mountain, one final river, and an ending unlike anything else in the entire history of how prophets in this story are remembered to have left the world. Years pass, and Ahab eventually dies in battle, exactly as Elijah had warned, struck by a stray arrow that found him, despite every precaution he took to disguise himself before riding out to war. His son Ahaziah inherits the throne, and inherits, along with it, very little of whatever humility his father found in that vineyard. Ahaziah falls through a lattice in an upper room of his palace and is badly injured. And instead of seeking the God of Israel for healing, he sends messengers to inquire of a foreign god, Baal-zebub, asking whether he will recover. This single decision tells you everything you need to know about how quickly the lessons of one generation can be discarded by the next. Ahab had at least once been brought low enough to tremble under the word of the Lord. His son seems to have learned almost nothing from that moment. Elijah meets the king's messengers on the road before they ever reach the foreign shrine, and sends them back with a question carrying its own quiet judgment. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of a God belonging to someone else? Tell the king, Elijah says, that he will not leave the bed he is lying on. He will die. Ahaziah's response to this message is not repentance. It is anger, and an attempt to assert control over a man his father had once feared and respected. He sends a captain with 50 soldiers to bring Elijah back to him by force. The captain finds Elijah sitting on a hilltop and addresses him with open contempt, calling him a man of God, only to mock him with the title, ordering him down in the king's name. Elijah's answer is severe and immediate. If I am a man of God, he says, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men. And fire falls, exactly as he said it would. And the captain and his 50 soldiers are gone. A second captain arrives with another 50 men, speaks to Elijah with the same contempt, and receives the exact same answer, and the exact same fire. This is a hard scene to sit with, honestly, and it deserves to be treated with the seriousness it asks for, rather than excitement. This is not the same fire that fell on Carmel in front of a watching nation, desperate to know the truth about who God really was. This is fire called down against soldiers sent specifically to seize a prophet of God by force. on the orders of a king who had just dismissed that same God as irrelevant to his own healing. This scene is not offered as entertainment. It shows the real and serious weight of treating God's authority as something that can simply be commanded and overridden by royal power. A third captain arrives with his own 50 men, and this time, before issuing any order, he falls on his knees in front of Elijah and begs for his life and the lives of his soldiers, asking that they be seen as precious in Elijah's sight rather than treated the way the previous 2 companies were treated. This time, the word of the Lord tells Elijah something different. Go down with him. Do not be afraid. Here is the 45th lesson, and it changes the meaning of everything that came before it in this chapter. The fire was never simply about raw power being unleashed without restraint. The moment genuine humility appears, the pattern changes completely, and Elijah is told to go, without fear, exactly the kind of instruction that would have been impossible for him to hear or trust only a short time earlier. Back under the broom tree, when fear had been the only thing he could feel at all, Elijah goes down and delivers the same message directly to Ahaziah's face that he had already sent through the messengers. The king who turned to a foreign god instead of the God of Israel will not recover from his injury. And Ahaziah dies, exactly as the word had said, leaving no son behind to inherit the throne after him. By the time this chapter closes, Elijah has shown both sides of what he carries within him. The same prophet who folded himself in half on a mountaintop, who walked 40 silent days on the strength of bread he did nothing to earn, who once asked simply to be allowed to die, is also a man capable of commanding fire from heaven with a single sentence. Neither side of him cancels out the other. Both are true at once, and both have always been true at once. Since the very first day, he walked uninvited into Ahab's palace and told a king the sky was about to obey him instead. There is one mountain left for Elijah to climb, and one river left for him to cross. And what waits for him there is unlike anything that has happened to any other prophet in the entire history of how this story has been told. Elijah knows, somehow, before anyone tells him directly, that this is the day. He sets out from Gilgal with Elisha walking beside him, and at each stop along the way, he tells his successor to stay behind while he continues on alone. Stay here, he says, for the Lord has sent me on to Bethel. And each time, Elisha refuses. As surely as the Lord lives, and as surely as you yourself live, he says, I will not leave you. This happens 3 times. Bethel, then Jericho, then finally the banks of the Jordan River itself. And each time, a group of prophets from the local schools approaches Elisha privately to ask whether he knows that his master is going to be taken from him that very day. And each time, Elisha answers the same way. Yes, he knows. Be silent about it. There is something worth noticing in this repeated refusal to leave. Elisha does not simply assume he will inherit Elijah's role automatically, the way a son inherits a father's position without having to earn it. He insists, 3 separate times, on staying close enough to witness whatever is about to happen, choosing presence over comfort, choosing to walk directly into the grief of watching his teacher disappear rather than waiting somewhere easier for news to reach him afterward. When they reach the Jordan, 50 of the prophets from the nearby schools follow at a distance and watch from far off as Elijah takes off his cloak, rolls it up, and strikes the water with it. The river splits in 2. The water piling up on either side, and the 2 men cross over on dry ground. It is impossible to miss the echo of everything that came before it in the larger story of this nation. The same river had parted once before, generations earlier, when Joshua led an entire people across it into the promised land, after Moses had already led them through the wilderness and laid down his own life on a different mountain without ever crossing over himself. Now the river parts again, this time for only two men. A prophet near the end of his life, and the successor walking beside him. And the parallel is too precise to be accidental. Something is closing here, in the same place where something else once opened. On the far side of the river, Elijah turns to Elisha and asks him directly what he can do for him before he is taken away. Elisha's request is bold, almost startling in its scope. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he says. This was not a request for twice the power simply for its own sake. In the inheritance customs of that world, a firstborn son received a double portion of his father's estate, a larger share specifically tied to the responsibility of carrying the family forward after the father was gone. Elisha is not asking to be twice as impressive as Elijah. He is asking to be recognized as the one who will carry the full weight of this calling forward. The way a firstborn son carries forward everything his father built. Elijah's answer carries its own weight. "You have asked a hard thing," he says. "Yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it will be yours. If you do not, it will not." The condition here is not arbitrary. It requires Elisha to keep watching, all the way to the very end, refusing to look away even in the moment that will be hardest to witness. The same insistence that kept him walking beside Elijah through 3 separate towns is now the exact thing required of him one final time, at the one moment that will matter most. And then, as the two of them are walking together, still talking, a chariot of fire appears, pulled by horses of fire, and it comes between them. And Elijah is taken up into heaven in a whirlwind. There is no death recorded here, no tomb, no body left behind to bury. The way every other prophet and king in this entire story eventually leaves one behind. Elijah simply ascends, in fire and wind, in full view of the one person who insisted on staying close enough to witness it. Elisha watches the whole thing happen, and cries out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." And then he sees him no more. He takes hold of his own clothes and tears them in two, the traditional expression of grief. And then he notices something lying on the ground near him. Elias's cloak, the same cloak that was thrown over his shoulders in a field years earlier, with no explanation given at the time, has fallen to the ground at the exact place where its owner just disappeared into the sky. Elisha picks it up. He walks back to the edge of the Jordan and strikes the water with it, the same gesture Elijah used to part the river only a short time earlier, and asks out loud, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The water parts again, and Elisha crosses back over, alone now, carrying forward exactly what he asked for at the river's edge. Here is the 46th lesson, and it may be the strangest gift this entire story leaves behind. This is one of the most unusual endings given to any major figure across this whole collection of stories. Moses dies on a mountain within sight of a promised land he never enters. Most of the prophets who come after Elijah simply finish their lives the way every human being eventually does. Elijah alone leaves without a tomb, without a body, carried away in fire and wind in full view of a single witness who insisted on staying close enough to see it happen. A life defined so much by exhaustion, by collapse, by a man who once begged to be allowed to die, ends instead with him being carried upward, still very much alive, into whatever comes next. And the story of Elijah does not actually end there, in the way most endings end. Centuries later, the prophet Malachi closes out the final book of the Old Testament with a promise that God will send Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord arrives, to turn the hearts of parents to their children and the hearts of children to their parents. A man who disappeared in fire and wind becomes, in that promise, someone still expected, someone whose story has not actually finished closing. Generations after that, in the New Testament, a man appears in the wilderness wearing rough clothing and living off locusts and wild honey, preaching repentance to a nation that has once again drifted into quiet, comfortable compromise. His name is John, and he comes, the text tells us, in the spirit and power of Elijah. The same fierce clarity, the same refusal to soften an uncomfortable truth for the sake of being liked. And later still, on another mountain, 3 of Jesus's closest followers watch him transformed in front of them, his face shining like the sun, his clothes becoming as white as light itself. And standing there with him, talking with him, are 2 men who should not, by any ordinary measure, to still be present in this story at all. One of them is Moses, who died and was buried in a place no one has ever found. The other is Elijah, who never died at all, carried up in fire and wind on the far side of a river that parted twice in a single afternoon. Centuries separate Horeb from this second mountain, and yet the connection between them is impossible to miss once you see it. A man who once stood in a cave on a mountain, convinced he was the last faithful person left in an entire nation, corrected gently by a silence too thin to ignore, is standing now on another mountain, in glory, beside the very figure whose presence proves exactly how wrong that lonely conviction always was. The mountain of collapse and the mountain of glory turn out to be closer together than anyone standing in that cave could have imagined. Here is the 47th lesson, and it is the one that refuses to let any of this turn Elijah into something other than what he actually was. A man named James, writing generations later, puts it as plainly as it can be put. Eliah, he writes, was a man with a nature like ours, not a different kind of being, not someone built for faith in a way ordinary people are not, a man who hid by a drying brook and depended on birds for food, a man who watched a widow's last handful of flour somehow keep feeding her family, a man who stood in front of an entire nation and called down fire, and then ran from a single threatening sentence only days later, and lay down under a tree and asked to die. A man fed by an angel, corrected gently in a cave, given a friend to walk beside him, and sent back out to keep telling the truth to power, right up until the very last river he ever crossed. That is who disappeared into the sky that day. Not a man who never struggled, a man who struggled enormously and kept going anyway, all the way to a chariot of fire that was waiting for him on the other side of his exhaustion, in a place he never could have imagined reaching back when he was lying face down in the dirt under a tree with no shade left to offer him anything at all. Elijah's life has lasted thousands of years in the memory of people who have never stood on a mountain or seen fire fall from a clear sky. And it has lasted that long for a reason that has very little to do with the fire itself. It is not. Underneath everything, a story about a man with unusual power. It is a map, and almost everyone who walks through it slowly ends up finding their own footprints somewhere on it. So before we close, let us walk back through the places this one man stood. And as we go, you can quietly ask yourself, which one is yours right now? Some of you are standing beside a brook that is drying up. You did everything you were told to do. You went exactly where you were sent. You stayed faithful to the instruction and the place that used to provide for you. The job, the relationship, the routine that once felt steady is thinning out anyway. A little more each day. With no clear end in sight, you keep checking the water level, hoping today is different. And today is not different. If that is where you are, remember that Elijah did nothing wrong at Cherith. The brook was never meant to last forever. It was meant to carry him through one season, and its drying up was not a punishment. It was a sign that the next place was already being prepared, even though he could not see it yet from where he was kneeling. Some of you are standing in a widow's kitchen, looking at a jar that should be empty by now. You have given away more than felt safe to give, trusted further than the evidence in front of you seemed to justify, and somehow, against what the math should have told you, there has still been enough. Not abundance, not a stockpile you can finally relax into, just enough. Again, today, the way it was enough yesterday. If that is where you are, the lesson of Zarephath is not that you will never run low again. It is that the kind of faith asked of you may never come with a guarantee you can hold in your hand in advance. It only ever comes one day, one portion, one quiet renewal at a time. Some of you are standing on Mount Carmel, after the fire has already fallen. You have just done the hardest, most public, most demanding thing you have ever done, and you are still standing in the smoke of it, waiting to feel the triumph everyone told you would come. If that is where you are, the rain Elijah waited for did not come instantly either. He sent his servant back 7 times before a cloud no bigger than a hand appeared on the horizon. Victory does not always arrive with applause already built in. Sometimes it arrives slowly, in small signs. After a great deal of watching an empty sky, some of you are lying under a broom tree, asking for permission to stop. You have already given everything you had to give. And the thing that finally broke you was not the big confrontation. It was something small. A single message. A single sentence. Arriving after the adrenaline had already drained out of your body, leaving you with nothing underneath it but how tired you actually are. If that is where you are, hear this clearly. Elijah's collapse was never treated as a failure of faith. It was met with bread and water and sleep, offered twice, without a single word of correction attached to either meal. Sometimes the most spiritual thing available to you is rest, taken without apology. Before anyone asks you to explain how you got there, some of you are standing in a cave on a mountain, convinced you are the last one left. The isolation does not feel like an exaggeration. It feels like the most honest thing you have ever said out loud. Everyone else seems to have given up, compromised, moved on. And you are the only one still holding the line. And the weight of believing that is heavier than almost anything else you carry. If that is where you are, remember the 7,000. Elijah was never told to stop feeling tired. He was simply told something true that he had no way of knowing on his own. That thousands of others were still faithful. quietly, invisibly, in places he never thought to look. You may not be able to see your 7,000 from where you are standing either. That does not mean they are not there. And some of you are standing in a field, holding a cloak that just landed on your shoulders, wondering whether you are ready for whatever it means. You have been asked to carry something forward, a responsibility, a calling, a piece of someone else's unfinished work. And you do not yet know if you have what it takes. If that is where you are, remember, Elisha did not wait until he felt ready. He burned the plow behind him, fed his community with what remained of his old life, and followed a tired, weathered prophet who had nothing to offer him except a question. What can I do for you before I am taken from you? The answer Elisha gave was bold because the need in front of him was bold. Whatever the cloak on your shoulders is asking, it did not land there by accident. Here is the thing about that broom tree, the one Elijah was lying under when this story first opened. He could have stayed there. Nothing in his story up to that point would have prevented it. He had already done more than most people are ever asked to do. Faced down a king, exposed a false religion in front of an entire nation, called down fire from a clear sky. He had earned, by any reasonable measure, the right to simply stop. And for one night, under that tree, he very nearly did. But the story did not end there. And the reason it did not end there was never that Elijah found some hidden reserve of strength inside himself to keep going. It was that something came to him while he slept, gently, without demand, and fed him before it asked anything of him at all. The 40 days that followed, the cave, the silence, the cloak in the field, the chariot of fire waiting decades later on the far side of a river. None of it began with Elijah pulling himself back together. It began with bread he did not earn, eaten by a man who had already decided he was finished. So the question this story leaves in the room is not really whether you admire Elijah. Admiring a man who called down fire is easy, and it costs nothing, and it changes nothing. The real question is quieter than that. What is your broom tree? Where is the place you are tempted to lie down and ask to stop? Not because your faith failed, but because you have carried more than any one person should be expected to carry alone. And when the hand finally touches your shoulder, however it arrives, however small or unspectacular it looks compared to the fire you once stood beside, will you let yourself be fed before you try to explain how you got so tired in the first place?